Dr. Baden, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today a little bit about the Hebrew Bible broad stroke. We know you are a specialist in all things Pentateuch, and we're going to pick your brain a little bit there. But I'm also interested in hearing some of your thoughts on some other things. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure.
For anyone who is interested, in thinking through the Hebrew Bible in a broader picture, you happen to have a number of lectures coming up, which is why you're joining us today. You're going to be doing a class with the Biblical Studies Academy all about the Hebrew Bible. And before we can turn to all of the Hebrew Bible, I feel like I would be remiss to not ask one question to begin on some of the Pentateuch things, because you are famous for your work here, work that's very appreciated and very helpful. So before we turn to broader pastures, could I just start with one question there?
Sure.
Within this space, within scholarly considerations, I should say, of this, the idea of sources is very well established. Your work on this, renewing the documentary hypothesis, has brought this to, I think, a lot of modern readers in a new way. Why do you feel like still, despite how well established this is within scholarly communities, the public is maybe less saturated with this idea or still holds on to older misconceptions about what this really means to move away from something like an idea of Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch to something new?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because how do I psychologize the masses? Honestly, one of the things I think to remember is, for 95+% of humanity, anything that we as scholars say isn't really important, and that's okay. That's okay. But especially when it comes to Bible, the vast majority of people today and forever have encountered the biblical text through their faith communities.
Mm-hmm.
And those faith communities, to varying degrees, have different stances on what this text is, and what it means. And honestly, for the vast majority of people, where it came from historically is actually not particularly important. And that's the kind of thing that I have to remind myself every so often to stay humble, is this is not actually the way that most people read, or the reason anyone cares about this text is where did it come from, though? The answer wouldn't change anything, right? Because they're reading the text as their text today. And its history, honestly, is not super relevant, because this text, like all texts, what it means is not defined by its origins, but by how people use it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What it does in the world is actually not particularly linked to where it came from. So I think that people care about this text and are interested in it, and are interested in its history because they care about it. And so I think that questions about who wrote the Bible or who wrote the Pentateuch have gotten some traction out there as a known topic.
Yeah.
I think, lots of people, you take a Bible class in college and it comes up, right? Whether it's a focus or not, it comes up. But I'm also willing to recognize that for lots of people, there's an attachment to the text that supersedes any interest in its history. That's okay.
I think that's very fair to say. It does pushes us a little bit, because our passions can sit in a different space than some of those, the needs, the desires of those individuals. And sometimes the conversation can turn to a place of well, let me help you care about it maybe in a new way or another way by unpacking some of these things.
Right.
But that might not be the most important thing for you.
Right. So here's the thing, right? I teach at a divinity school. When I teach an introductory course on the Hebrew Bible, as the course I'm teaching, online, I'm teaching in that circumstance lots of people who are planning on going on into ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're going on to serve communities of faith. And the thing that I know as I'm teaching them is most of what I am telling them in this class is not going to be directly translated into a sermon. right? Like they're not ever going to be out there preaching or maybe even teaching, even in Bible study, like aspects of like the history of the text or even like the historical world the text comes from, because that's not how most communities of faith use the text. But what I find to be really important is like is not that people like necessarily like know, or like not, they could be like, oh, that verse is from J, or like whatever, or that they even agree necessarily with, or that it matters to them much. The key part about like the historical critical enterprise, which of course like composition of the Pentateuch questions are deeply a part of, and this is something I'll talk about in the class as well, but like one of the key like payoffs of the historical critical is not necessarily the convincing of people that like, oh, this is what the text really is or was or means, but actually the reminder that what you today in your community of faith think that it means is not a stable, universal, objective thing, right? But like, in fact, that like, they thought something, they read it differently back then, or it meant something differently back then. Not to say it ought to mean that for you now.
Right.
Like, you don't have to like read it and be like, oh, sources. But like, it's useful to know that the Pentateuch is put together from sources, even if you can't identify them, just so that you can like contrast that with what your community of faith thinks, and then ask questions like, well, why do we think that? And like, what is the meaning? Like, how are we making meaning out of this? As opposed to being like, well, I mean, the thing that I believe is the true thing.
Mm-hmm. When you turn from, I guess, just looking at the Pentateuch, because you're not going to spend all of your time in this class
Right.
dealing with the Pentateuch as much as some individuals might want you to as members in the class.
It would have to be a different class.
It would have to be a different class, which I think would still be a wonderful class. But you're turning to, the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. So as you broaden that scope out, starting with those conversations in the Pentateuch to say, hey, we're jumping in and we're unpacking some of these things. As you move into later texts where I think different types of attachments and emotional concerns do start to emerge. People love the stories of Genesis and things, yes, but once you come to characters like a David, different ideas or stories like Ruth start to rise up in people's communities and in their memories and in their associations. Are there ways that as you teach this material, you feel like you have to change or adapt how you present those types of historical considerations and the way the payoffs look? Or does it kind of naturally develop for the student over time? Trying to think, for the person who might be looking to come to this thinking, I've heard this conversation with the Pentateuch before, but yeah. What about when we get later? Like, doesn't that end? Because the sources, once we get later in, we're moving past that. So what else is there to say with those things?
Yeah. I mean, and I know that there is not a single book of the Bible that is not susceptible to a trenchant historical critique. It's not always the same, right? Like the things that I care about in the Pentateuch have to do with like authorship and different voices, being interwoven. And like, I think there's interesting stuff to be said about that. And I think that it affects people, as you said, in different ways. When I come to something like the David story, I'm gonna break your brain about the David story too, but like not necessarily in a like, it's multiple stories that have been woven together kind of way. More in a like, this character who has been for 2,000 years plus like 3,000 years, like the hero of the Bible, is like probably not so like historically probably not so good. And what is the David story doing as a story in the text, right? So, I mean, there's like all these different aspects of the thing. In all of them, though, it's kind of a game of like, what happens if I read this book or read this text like not the way that I read it today, but like, what if I tried to put myself in the shoes of somebody who was reading it when it was written, like, in that context, and like again, that like it's a different kind of thing from book to book. I don't know, like you pick up the book of Isaiah, and people today read it and they're like, look, it's Jesus. right? Like, we all hear like Handel's Messiah playing in our head, and like it's terrific. And that's not wrong for that. Like, that's how that community reads it. That's great. But that's not how they read it in like, 8th century ancient Israel, 8th century BC ancient Israel, right? Like, they probably weren't reading it and being like, oh, look, it's Jesus, right? So what were they reading it? And what were they making of it? And how does that let me then understand how I read it? And why? I will admit I don't read it as being about Jesus, but fine. Like there's there's aspects of just about every book. Now I can't cover every single book in the course, because even with 28 lectures, it's just too much. The Hebrew Bible is very big, but we'll hit on lots of the big famous parts and some small not so famous parts. And in every case, we're gonna ask, like, what was this text up to? What was it doing? Where did it come from? Why does it exist? Why does it look the way that it does? In some cases, how did it get from what it was to what it is now? I don't know. I think there's like interesting stuff to be asked about every bit of it.
It is one of those things, once you get someone started on the path and you like start turning over the stones, I think those big ones like mosaic authorship, those are things that people are like, oh yes, I know that's a question that I've heard about. But some of those littler topics, once that conversation or that process has begun, can become very interesting and fruitful places for additional consideration or new ways to put the texts in conversation with each other, to say like, hey, we're not just coming up with this now. Look, the text is doing it. It has been doing it this whole time. Yeah. And maybe we've just been, missing the forest for the trees.
Or the other way around. Right.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing that happens, right? Like, people have attachments to different aspects. I remember many years ago, I was teaching sort of the equivalent introductory class. And I don't know, I was somewhere in Genesis still. I was talking about like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and where these stories come from, and et cetera. And I had a student come up to me afterwards and he was like, I was totally cool with like, obviously like creation and the flood and the Tower of Babel. But those are obviously mythology. And then you were like, started talking about like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I was like, uh-oh. Right. And it's interesting because like, it's like, we're talking about a matter of like a few chapters on in the same book. But people have a line, right? Like there's like a mental line that people have and they're often not aware of, where it's like, yeah, totally. What? Right. Like, and you cross the line and they're like, oh, I didn't know that I was attached in this way, or I didn't know that I cared about this in a certain way. But it is useful, I think, to start in it's useful to start in the Pentateuch, not just because it's the beginning, but like, if you can get people through like, and this is, I'm not making a secret of this, if you can get people through like the Exodus didn't happen, like if you can get through like, that's not a real story, that's like completely made up and like there's no historical basis to it whatsoever, like that breaks enough people's brains that like they're kind of set up for the rest, right? Like, then if I get to, and I'm like, you know what, I don't think David wrote the Psalms, it's like, yeah, like if the Exodus didn't happen, this is okay, right? Like, so it is about finding the lines, but it's also about, gradually over the course of the semester, over the course of the class, like opening people to the increasing possibility of things not being what they look like, or not being what they've been taught, or what they grew up thinking, and then trying to pin down like, I don't know, like the David one is a great one because, as you said, like lots of people can be like, yeah, no, I know, like Moses, Exodus, whatever, like obviously nonsense, but the notion of David as cultural hero is like really baked in. Like really, it's baked into the Bible. It's baked in for the last 2,000 years since then. It's like, that's, it's all over the place. And it's not just that people are like, oh no, I thought it was true, or one way or another. It's like, I had an attachment to this figure or this story, and unpacking like what's happening in the text and how the story came to be, and like why do we have this attachment, and like why do we view David the way that we do. Again, it's like, what I'm really super most interested in is like the space between us and then,
Right.
Us now here and them then and there, right? Like, where are the places where we, and like this is critical, this is like just critical thinking and historical critical thinking in like its most basic form, but like where are the places where we recognize that we're not like them, and where are the places where we have not yet figured out that we're not like them, or the places where we haven't yet figured out like that what we think isn't what was. And like critical scholarship for 200 whatever years has been slowly like rolling that ball down the court. That's not an expression, but like but you know what I mean, like they like we've been more and more understanding like, oh yeah, we just assumed that it was like this, or I assumed that they understood the things this way the same that I do, but like we keep on uncovering more and more things that's not true about. I mean, and this is in a sense why historical criticism necessarily, I think, gives rise to what we think of as like, I don't know, things like feminist criticism and post-colonial criticism. Like these other critical modes of engaging are all, you know, in a way like mechanisms for us to be like, not like, they're not like us, right? Like, oh, I mean, whatever. It was like in the 1960s, 70s that people were like, oh, women. Like, you know, and like even historically critically, like people were like, oh, yeah, I guess like maybe the way that like gender relations worked in the Bible aren't exactly the same way they work today. Like maybe we need somebody to study that as a thing, right? That's not actually dissimilar from like, oh, you know what? I think actually like our understanding of God is probably not the same as their understanding of God, which we got too much earlier. That was a lot of talking.
When the insight into that, I think from a public perspective, sometimes the perception can be, well, scholars are of one mind and they have identified all of these things together. But the ability to bring people in to say, no, things like this identification of bias or blind spotting still exists within scholarly readings, and scholars are continuing to try to expand and advance this. And so as you as a student are participating in this, you're engaging in something that has been going on and it's not set, right? Your reading isn't fixed, their reading isn't fixed, the scholarly readings aren't fixed. It needs to keep getting better. Mm-hmm. But that invitation has to like bring you in to bring some of your questions, because that can be one of the most beautiful moments when it is like a student question that makes you go like, oh yeah, like that is a different way, maybe sometimes just to frame it, that can open the door to new considerations or new ideas in the space of that gap itself. That gap is a good place to live in. It's not a bad place to be. It's a very good place to be.
Yeah, I mean that's where we want people to be, and that's, you know, the joy of the teaching of this stuff is watching people and like helping people to like occupy that space, right? It's helping people to be like, oh, yep, like we are different. Why are we different? Who were they? The question of like who were they and what were they up to back then inevitably leads to who am I and what am I up to now? And so it's like, yeah, there's very much there's a modeling and a participating that's going on in the teaching learning process, right? Like, I mean, what I'm trying to do in the course as a whole is to have the students read the text through my eyes. What is it that I see when I look at this text? And also to have them like join me. You know, I'm sort of like, I want to go on a journey here. And I want you to come with me. And as we all know, right, like when you journey to a foreign land, like not only do you learn more about them, but you learn a lot more about yourself, and like you recognize your own biases and your own weirdnesses and like what you've taken for granted. And that's what we're doing here. Like we are taking a journey to right, like my favorite very famous and overused expression is, right, like the past is a foreign country, right? They do things differently there. I love that. We're going there, right? Like we're gonna take a trip to essentially a foreign country, and it's gonna be weird though, because you're gonna be like, I recognize all this stuff, but it doesn't look the same.
So I think it should be fairly clear to people, but this is not a class for scholars, right? If you are coming to this class and you're thinking, I would love this, but I feel like maybe I don't have the training. I haven't done all of this before. This is a class for people who are looking to begin this endeavor, correct?
Absolutely, right? Like there's nothing assumed except that you're interested in this. That's all you got to walk in with. And I promise I will try and explain everything. Well, not everything. I promise that I will make it as easy as possible. It's an introductory class. It's an introductory class. Like I teach this introductory class at Yale, and this is like very much the same principle. It's like, let's walk in and like simply with the assumption that you know what the Bible is. That's really all it takes. But that's the most fun part of the journey, is the going from like, I don't know, to like, ooh, now I know, or now I understand, or now I have actually more questions than I began with, which is even better.
The best place to leave it, and a prereq that is just you are interested in the topic, is the best type of prereq that can exist for a class. So if you're interested in joining Dr. Baden for this, well, good news, they begin at the beginning of September. So you can join these classes coming up very shortly. If you are, maybe you're missing being in class a little bit, you can come and join this endeavor through the Hebrew Bible. Dr. Baden, thank you so much for taking the time today to come and talk a little bit about the class, but also about the process of engaging in the questions of these texts.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And if you're interested, the link is down in the description. Dr. Baden looks forward to seeing you there.
I sure do.